My name is Joshua Waits. I'm the archivist here at Virginia Theological Seminary. Today is June 20th, 2023 at approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, and I am here with the Reverend Shawn Strout, Ph.D., who is here to give his oral history. Dr. Strout, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure.
So just some basic biographical information. Will you start by telling us your full name?
Sure. Shawn Owen Strout.
And how would you prefer us to address you? Dr. Strout, Reverend Strout, Shawn?
I think for the purposes of this oral history, Shawn would be great.
Shawn?
Yeah.
All right. Would you please tell us how you identify and the pronouns you use?
Sure. I identify as a gay cis male, he, him, his.
Thank you very much. When and where were you born?
I was born in Claremont, New Hampshire, April 20, 1971.
Would you mind telling us a bit of your history in New Hampshire and some of your spiritual autobiography?
Sure. So I should mention that I was baptized as an infant in the Roman Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. I mention that because I didn't actually really grow up in the Roman Catholic Church. My parents became Baptists when I was about 3 or 4 years old. And then, as I like to tell my students, I'm a heretic because I was rebaptized in the Baptist church. I don't remember the exact age. I remember the event. So I think I was about 9 or 10 years old, somewhere around in there. But I definitely remember being baptized and growing up in that church. And then when I was 13, we moved down to Florida, outside of Orlando. And I went to junior high school at the time there in Orlando, and then high school. And we started going in New Hampshire. We had gone to a Baptist church that's part of the Conservative Baptist Alliance. In Orlando, we started going to a Southern Baptist church. So very much the fundamentalist version of the Baptist tradition. And I got very involved. I was all through high school. I got very involved. My parents were very involved in church and had been. We would go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night Bible study, Thursday night visitation. And I sang in the choir at different times. I was very involved in Sunday school. The only thing I didn't do, I did not go to a Christian school. I didn't, because the main church, we went to a couple of different churches in Florida, but the one I spent the most time in had a Christian school, and we went to public school. And so there was a bit of a feeling of being kind of outside, because when you go to a church that has a Christian school, the kids who go to the school are kind of the in clique. And so I did feel a little like I was outside. But through all that experience, I felt a call to become a pastor. And so talking with my pastor, my youth pastor, my parents and everything, I decided to go to Pensacola Christian College, which is a very fundamentalist school in Pensacola, Florida, to train to be a pastor. So I headed up there. I graduated high school in 1989, and so headed up there to Pensacola and went to school there. I majored in Bible. Initially, I minored in voice, but my voice teacher suggested I change my minor. I still sing to this day, but she suggested it was a good choice to make. So I changed to speech. And in my sophomore year, I met they were freshmen and I was a sophomore, some friends, and got really involved in theater. I had been involved in theater in high school and some high school plays and stuff, and then in college got really involved. And that was a real lifesaver for me because it gave me a chance to really get to meet people and socialize. And because up to that point, I've always been a really good student and very put studies first. but I was probably being a little too much of a student initially. It's like a little too much studying. And so I met these folks in theater, and that gave me a really great opportunity to just meet some more people. And then graduated from college from that. And it's interesting because as I look back on it, nobody really talked to me about like how you actually get ordained. Like for Episcopalians, we all know this because there's the process that we call it, and it's all detailed and outlined, and everybody knows all the steps that are involved in it once you enter into it. But I never so nobody ever told me, okay, now what? What do I do to actually get ordained? And of course, through all of this time, starting somewhere around 12, 13 years old, I had started to have attractions to people of the same gender as myself. But of course, because of my environment, that was a sin, and so I was very much trying to repress it and all of those things, and had those experiences even in college, even had a bit of an infatuation for a roommate while I was in college, which was, again, kind of mind-opening for me. So when I left college and came back, I went back home to live with my parents for a little bit while I just tried to figure out, okay, what next? I guess in a certain way, I wasn't pursuing ordination a whole lot myself either. Like, I wasn't asking a lot of questions. I wasn't going up and saying, okay, what next? And I think looking back on it now, I think there was kind of just a subtle shift going on in my own self right around that. Because it wasn't too long after that I got to meet, these are in the early days of computers and internet, back in a time when we used to have bulletin board systems, back pre-AOL. And I just met some people through that who were gay, and I started to learn more about what it meant and what was going on, and started to kind of really enter into what we call the coming out process and coming out to myself. And I do remember that one of the most important books for me was a book by Mel White, Stranger at the Gate, where he had grown up in the evangelical church. He'd gotten married, he'd had family, and then he had gone through all these things, even electroshock therapy to try to stop being gay, all these things, and then finally realized he couldn't divorce his wife, ended up with a man at that time. Maybe today he's married to that man. I don't know. And reading that book was a turning point for me, because I saw myself on that same path. And I distinctly remember, very distinctly remember thinking I was at a crossroads. I had this path. I could go down the path of Mel White, where I would continue to be in the church, continue to do all this, and live this closeted life, have a wife, have a family, but probably be miserable like he was. Or I could choose to say, no, God loves me for who I am, and I'm going to come out, and I'm going to be who I am. And I chose that path, and I remember it very clearly that was a choice that I made, to choose that path, that no, I'm going to believe, despite what I was being told, believe that God does actually love me for who I am and created me as a gay man. So I did have the wisdom to wait until I moved out of my parents' house before coming out to them. So I did wait until I moved out of the house before that happened. And then I did, and we had a conversation. It was really hard. It was a very, very difficult conversation. My mother in particular took it very, very hard. And it took a while. It took us a few years to kind of get over that conversation. But I will say now, I mean, that's many, many years ago for me. And for now, most of my adult life now, I can say they've been very accepting, very, they come and visit me and my partner, my spouse, and love him to pieces. In fact, I say sometimes they like him better than they like me. So they're, they've made a huge shift. But that initial conversation, that initial coming out was tough. It also, for me, meant leaving the church. And I left the church for a while. I tried going to Metropolitan Community Church a little bit. There was a Methodist church that was pretty open to try doing that. But I actually kind of started to explore the other religions, and kind of just went on what I call my spiritual wandering phase. And did that for quite a while. I met somebody. He and I moved to North Carolina for a job that he took there. We lived there for a couple of years, and then we moved here to Washington, D.C. And soon that relationship ended, and I was in Washington, D.C. And this gets us to we moved here in 2001, and then, of course, in 2003 is when Bishop Gene Robinson was consecrated as the first openly gay bishop in the Episcopal Church. Mm-hmm. And it was then that I really first kind of noticed the Episcopal Church. Of course, I knew about the Episcopal Church, but never really had thought about it at all. And that was when I first noticed it. And Bishop Robinson was going to come and talk at a parish here in D.C. And I thought, well, I want to check out what he has to say. But I went really expecting I was not going to like the worship service. Really thought it'd be formal and stuffy and wasn't going to like it. Well, I went. Bishop Robinson was lovely, as he always is. It was great talk. But what I came away from that experience was I fell in love with the worship service. I fell in love with the liturgy. So I started talking with other friends and people and reading and stuff, because I was like, okay, if I'm going to... And by that point, I'd already started kind of thinking about coming back to Christianity. I'd been exploring the United Church of Christ, and discovered a parish, All Souls, in D.C., and started attending there. The rector there was openly gay, partnered, and got confirmed there. And while there, felt my call to ministry resurface. Mm. And so I started the process and went through all of that, came here to Virginia Theological Seminary in 2009. So I was here from 2009 to 2012. By this point, I had also met my spouse. And we had lived in Crystal City for a bit, and then at this point now we're living in Annandale, Virginia. So I actually attended here as a commuter student. I never lived on campus itself. I attended as a commuter student from 2009 to 2012. And then after I graduated, I got ordained. But while I was here, I also felt a call to academic ministry as well as parish ministry. So I worked for a bit in the parish, my first parish. I worked in for 2 years, and then in the second year that I was there, I started applying for a doctoral program and got accepted to Catholic University of America here in D.C. as in liturgical studies, sacramental theology. So that first experience with that Episcopal Church grew into an entire academic vocation, my love for liturgy. And got my Ph.D. at Catholic. That was a challenge, because at this point in my life, I was, well out of the closet, and just living my life as a fully openly gay man, and going to Catholic University. It's a pontifical school, which means it's run by Rome, and I felt like I needed to just be circumspect. I wouldn't say I necessarily went back in the closet while I was there, but I just didn't talk about my personal life a whole lot. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be a wise decision, because I was in a teaching fellowship, and in the last year of my teaching fellowship, I was getting ready to teach a new group of freshmen for the intro to theology class that they're all required to teach. And about 2 weeks before the semester started, the dean asked me to come to his office. And apparently a very eager parent of one of these incoming freshmen had done a very thorough Google search of me and discovered that I have a partner. And I say thorough because while I'm out, it's not something I necessarily emblazon all over my whole life and social media and everything. And so this person had really done a lot of searching to find this information and had reported it to the school. And Rome had just that year issued an encyclical that all teachers at pontifical schools, no matter what level, teacher fellows to full professors, had to abide not only by the doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church, but its morals as well. So I was told, to their credit, they didn't kick me out of the fellowship, but I was told I could not teach Catholic moral theology or morals, so I couldn't teach that intro to class. Since it was so close to the semester, I didn't teach anything that semester, but they did give me the opportunity to teach like intro to religion the following semester. So I finished out my teaching fellowship and then finished out my dissertation later on and graduated. I do just want to say for the record that my teachers at Catholic University were great. I love them. I really academically thoroughly enjoyed the program there at Catholic, but did have some real problems with, with it being such a conservative school around that. And I'll just share one poignant example of this. Right around that same time, in fact, it may have even been the same day. I can't quite recall if it was the same day or soon after that I had this conversation with the dean. I came here to VTS because I was also going to teach here as an adjunct. And I don't remember what brought me on campus, but I came here on campus and I went to our coffee shop, the Flamingo. And at this point, we had students who were, of course, gay, lesbian, bisexual, but also some transgendered students as well. And I just saw all of these students and the diversity right there in the coffee shop, talking and everything. And I just remember feeling what a juxtaposition between being in a place where I felt like I had to just be quiet and a little careful to being in a place where I didn't feel that way at all. So I ended up coming here initially on staff. Then I was a visiting professor. And then, let's see, this is 2023. It was fall of 2021. Yeah, that's right. It was when I became assistant professor of worship and the associate dean of chapel.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So I do have a few follow-up questions.
Sure.
You gave us all of that so succinctly, but there was a lot to unpack there.
Sure, yeah.
So going back to when your family moved to Florida and started attending a Southern Baptist church there, and that is in Orlando, where you were attending.
Yeah.
So you were going into the Southern Baptist Church during that period that is often called the conservative resurgence. Right? So you were there when the denomination was quite literally changing and shifting, and the Baptist cooperative was forming and separating. Was those tensions, do you remember those tensions being present in your church in Orlando?
Absolutely, yeah. And so, actually we were in 3 churches. 2 of the 3 were actually independent Baptist churches.
Oh, yeah.
So aficionados of Baptist currents know the independent Baptist churches thought the Southern Baptist Church was too liberal and had left. So 2 of them were, and the one that I spent the most time that I was talking about was always on the verge. And there were even at least once or twice that we had a congregational vote that I remember about whether we wanted to leave or not. And we didn't leave, but was right always in the tipping point. So yes, I was very much not only in the Southern Baptist tradition, but at the very right of it, or even outside of it, even further right. Yeah. It was difficult to get more fundamentalist than I was at the time.
Yeah, I just find that interesting because also I know that one of the major leaders of the sort of conservative resurgence in the Southern Baptists was Dr. Jerry Vines in Jacksonville. So you were right there in the hub of, because the three major names in the Baptist tradition in the Southern Baptist was Dr. Jerry Vines, and then Dr. Charles Stanley in Atlanta, and then Dr. Adrian Rogers, which South Carolina, I think is where he was, because those were the three that led the movement.
Yes. Yeah.
So you were in the middle of all of this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
My second follow-up question is: you said you started attending VTS in 2009. So Rosanna Hook had already came. She came in 2003.
Yeah.
And then Bill Roberts.
Yeah, he was here.
Were those the only LGBT professors at the time?
Openly gay professors at the time, yes.
All right.
Yeah, those were the two.
And you were a commuter.
I was, yeah.
So what was it like? Were you actively engaged with the student body life on campus? Or was it one of those things you went to class and you went home?
Yeah, no, I was. I definitely was. And we did have the LGBT group. I don't remember right now. Now it's called PRISM, but that wasn't what we called it back then. I don't remember what we called it back then. But it was active, and honestly, it was more active than it is now, interestingly enough. And I was very involved in that, and my partner at the time would also come with me to things like that. So, and Dr. Roberts, Bill Roberts, and his partner would often host those gatherings, and we would go. And it was, I think, my experience of it, I think for most people was it was certainly an opportunity to find support among each other. For many of us, it was not as important as it was for some of our international students. We do remember that some of our international students, it was a lifeline for them. It was very important for them to be able to have that space. Because I certainly felt very comfortable, because by this point in 2009, BTS has changed, its policies. It had changed its housing policy. In fact, it had, of course, this is still pre-same-sex marriage. So at the time, you had a choice as a same-sex couple that you could either combine your assets and act as if you're a couple or not. Now I'll put on the record and readily admit I made the practical decision, which was to say, well, I'm going to keep our assets separate so I could get a full scholarship, because this is also back before we had the robust scholarship program we currently have. So I made that choice, but that was completely, again, just for practical reasons. It had nothing to do with being out or anything like that. I didn't feel, and students who were partnered were welcome in residence halls. We didn't have the apartments at the time, but we had the subsidized apartments, and they could live in the subsidized apartments and so forth. So, I felt quite welcome. I don't recall ever feeling unwelcome or having any experience of homophobia. But I will say, though, there was a professor at the time who everyone knew did not agree with same-sex marriage. I knew it and so forth. Everyone knew that. I never felt unwelcomed by him. But I did have, one of my classmates was the first person in the Diocese of Virginia to be ordained as in a same-sex partnership. And she had a very different relationship with this professor than I did. because he was also part of the Diocese of Virginia. And so her experience of him was very, very different than my experience. I ended up becoming his TA at one point, and we even sat down and talked about same-sex marriage before I ended up leaving, and I didn't really learn anything new from the conversation. I don't think he learned anything new from the conversation, but I guess I was comfortable enough with my own, not only my own sexuality, but my own belovedness in God, that the fact that somebody didn't agree with me on it was not, for me, was not a personal attack. It was just, okay, we disagree on this, and we can agree on these other things over here. And that was how my experience of him was. But for others, they had a different experience.
Did you have any negative or pushback type experiences from the student body?
No. Now that is also where being a commuter student could have had an impact, because I didn't have as much of the informal time with student, because being here on campus, people, were just hanging out more in the refectory other than just lunch, or hanging out on the patio and talking and, all of that. I didn't have those experiences. So my time on campus was, when I came, but I came, I would come every day for morning prayer, and at the time we had Eucharist at noon and go to Eucharist. And, even if I didn't have classes, I would still be here for some portion of the day. But I didn't have as much informal interactions. So, it's possible that other students may have had some homophobic experiences with other students in that way. But I certainly never had any, which would have been like in the classroom or, in a very kind of public way. Never had that experience.
When it came to your sort of your Midler eval and the faculty endorsing you for ordination, was there any pushback there?
No, other than this one faculty member who had made it a practice to abstain from all endorsements of the ordination. By this point, this one faculty member, my understanding was anyway, he just did not, he abstained from all faculty votes for endorsement to ordination. So he abstained to mine, but I guess he abstained to everyone's, so I think that was his way of handling it. But to be honest with you, even if he had actually said something, and voted, it wouldn't have bothered me again, because I saw his experience coming out of his own principles. I didn't see him as being personal to me.
Yeah, I know that from what I understand, that by the time that Dr. Hook was here, it had become the practice for at least the professors that remained after the 1997 decision of the board to admit openly out gay people. It had become the practice of at least three of those professors to abstain. That was the tradition.
Right.
Because, as always in the Episcopal Church, if we can figure out a compromise, we will. And that was the compromise, that they would, they could hold their theological positions, but they would not obstruct the process for others. Yeah. And
I think by this time there was only one of those three
remaining
left. Yeah.
When did you start attending Catholic U again?
Oh, Catholic U was 2014, fall 2014, when I started there. Yeah.
All right. So you were at Catholic U when Obergefell went through the Supreme Court and gay marriage was found.
Yeah.
Did that have an effect on your time at Catholic U?
No, to be honest with you, that didn't, for a couple of reasons. First, my area, so in a PhD program, you're much more concentrated in your own area than you are in like an MDiv program or something. So my area of liturgical studies it's just a more open and ecumenical kind of area. Both the professors I never, I have no idea what their personal politics are, but I never in any way felt like they were trying to do any kind of political agenda one way or the other. And then the students also, by and large, were the same way. Now, had I been in like moral theology or systematics, I'm sure that would have been very different, and I would have had a different experience. What I do remember, actually, which was a bit of a shock for me, was around abortion, because every year the students get the day off for March for Life, and many of the undergraduate students will go and do that, and that was just like, oh wow, okay. I just didn't, and just kind of experiencing that was the more overt thing.
Many that I've talked to have said in their experience that seminary is not the church. Now, you occupy a very unique place in both being a priest who has worked in the parishes and being an academic. What was it like for you when you earned your MDiv and were ordained? And went out to try to find a parish to work in?
Well, but I think what they're saying is that seminaries may be a little more open and safer than the church. I am a priest in the Diocese of Washington. So that's an important context. I was not going back to other dioceses that apparently, I frankly was a little surprised that there are still dioceses even today that are still giving LGBT folks a really hard time. I always had to keep that in mind, that my experience of the Episcopal Church, by and large, has been the Diocese of Washington, for good or for ill. It's got its strengths, it's got its challenges. And so I've always, and so for me, it was not an issue. I mean, I would tell, my first job was with actually the person that I was where I was at for contextual ministry. So they already knew me. They knew my story and everything. And I would make it a point to make sure that when I was interviewing for a position, that I would mention that I have a partner, and is that going to be a problem? Is that going to be an issue or anything? And the answer was always no, and has not been. I can't think of ever any kind of homophobic experience I've had in my parish ministry, to date, at least. So, but again, I serve in the Diocese of Washington, which has been kind of a vanguard of progressive theology and politics in the Episcopal Church.
At least since Bishop Walker's been there.
That's right.
So you have this very fascinating story of being baptized Roman Catholic, raised Baptist, then thrust into fundamentalist Baptist traditions, then wandering till you're in the Episcopal Church, where you fall in love with the liturgy, a call to ministry, priesthood, academic life to become a liturgics professor. And then, so I'm curious, how has all of that experience, this has shaped your theological understanding of liturgy and just your theological understanding in general?
Yeah, I think when I was a student here, 2009 to 2012, VTS had a motto at the time that we don't currently use, and I'm not sure why we don't. I liked it. And that was open and orthodox was the motto at the time. And I really liked it because having gone on this whole spiritual journey and coming back to Christianity, I was like, well, if I'm going to come back to Christianity, then it's got to mean something. This was a deliberate choice for me. Because I had practiced Buddhism for a bit. I had, dabbled in other practices and everything. And it's like, okay, for me, it was like, I'm coming back and I'm coming back because I really believe the Christian story has something to say and that there is a coherence to that story. And I believe that orthodoxy in the terms of creedal orthodoxy, not politics, not social orthodoxy, but orthodoxy in terms of believing in the Trinity, believing in the resurrection, those things, those are important pieces of the Christian story. And for the Christian story to make sense as a faith journey, you've got to kind of buy into those pieces. Now, you don't have to buy into them in the kind of literalist way I did growing up. I think this is where, understanding and, Ricord talks about a second naivete, that you've kind of go through and you have that experience and then you critique it. And that's been my life. And I critiqued it, I rejected it for a while, and then I kind of returned back to it, but not with the same kind of literalist mindset that I've had, but still taking it seriously and still saying, these parts of the story are important. And if we start to just say, okay, I'm going to accept these bits and not accept these bits of the core story, then does that story start to fall apart? And does it become another story? And so that's something that's been important to me, something I've appreciated. I appreciate about this institution as a student, and I appreciate about this institution as a faculty member, is that I believe this is true of all of my colleagues on the faculty, we believe the core story. We believe it, Now, we might interpret it a little bit differently in different ways, and that's what academics do and so forth. But I think we really do believe it, and it's not just a head thing for us. It's a heart thing as well. So that's important. But then to understand that then that core story, at least for me, has led to this openness around a lot of the social issues that we're dealing with, and the ability to say, if we believe in a God of love, then that love should extend to all people, regardless of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, their race, ethnicity, etc. So, that's something I've appreciated. And I will also say, a little bit outside the scope of this conversation, but I've also appreciated the attempts, the sincere attempts this institution has also made to try to reckon with its racial history, and that is meaningful to me and has helped me also recognize my own place as a white person in this institution and in America writ large, and to take that seriously too. And I think that, for me, that's where it comes out, is that if I take this Christian story seriously, then these other issues come from that, and I can take them seriously too, out of that core story.
Yeah, I remember that there was an interview done of Bishop Gene Robinson in which he was, of course, they were coming at it from the angle of, for him to be a bishop, you're throwing away all of Christian tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And his response was, he said, I'm wildly conservative theologically.
Mm-hmm.
And the woman who was interviewing went, so virgin birth? He went, absolutely. Resurrection, why not?
Yeah.
Because, and then he goes on sort of to explain, none of those things have anything to do with who I am as a gay man.
Right.
So,
or have everything to do with it,
right?
In the sense that God came down, incarnated God's self to live as love among us,
right?
And then ought we not to live as love among each other? So it's so it doesn't. And I knew what he was trying to say in the sense of I can believe these things and yet still be a gay man. But yeah, I'm sure he would say, knowing him as I don't know him personally, but just knowing his message as I do, that these core beliefs feed into this sense,
right?
Because I really believe this story that the God of love came to dwell among us. That produces in me this desire to love other people, even when I don't understand them.
As a liturgist, though, you are very much tied to the tradition, and your whole academic endeavor is to study the tradition in some way. How do you merge your reality, your appreciation of the core, that, and therefore that can feed into the affirming of who you are as a person, as a gay man, and yet also then when you go into the tradition, not necessarily all of those who wrote our liturgies would agree with where you are.
Sure.
I think most famously is like Chrysostom had some quite hard things to say.
Right.
So as a liturgist, how do you engage with the tradition?
Sure. Yeah.
In that way.
Well, I think it's when we study liturgy and when we study how liturgy contextualizes itself through the course of history and in different parts of the world and geographically, we do see this constant tension between carrying the gospel core throughout the tradition, and yet also contextualizing with where we are. And there's no better example of that, I think, than the liturgy. That as you see it move through time and move to different places, even when it has been carried by the ships of colonialism, and there have been attempts to try to enforce some kind of uniformity on other cultures, that's only successful to a limited degree. We start to see ways in which it bleeds out through dance, through movement, through music, through art, all these different ways in which, even when you try to enforce a particular point of view, the liturgy resists that. Liturgy resists that kind of top-down enforcement. Liturgy is very much from the local, but it also is, like you say, about tradition. It's about carrying it forward. And Robert Taft, a liturgical scholar, talks about this, that tradition, to be real tradition, is a living tradition. And it's not something that's just dead that you carry from one place to the next. It's a message. It's a story that you're carrying forward, but it needs to always be contextualized for this group of people and this time. And the liturgy is where that happens. And I think that's what we're going through right now, is that we're carrying forward the gospel message, but we're contextualizing it for 2023 in our case here, North America, which is different than 2023 in Nigeria or in, the Southern Cone or in other parts of the world. Their contextualization is very different than our contextualization. What we have to be careful about, and I think as Christians, what we have always had this tendency to do, is to say, no, my contextualization is supposed to be yours. And if you don't understand and see the story in the same way that I do, then you're wrong and you're not a Christian. And I think that's, that we've had that battle since the beginning of Christianity. I mean, anyone who studies church history sees that we've always done that. And so what we're currently going through right now is just another phase of that, another way in which we're trying to figure out as a church, okay, what does it mean to be true to the gospel, and not to let that go and not to water that down, that core story, be true to the gospel, but to be able to do so in today's context.
What do you think, or how do you think the liturgy is contextualized in the lives of LGBT people? Have you ever given it thought?
Yeah. Well, of course, it's always important when we talk about the liturgy. What are we talking about? Are we talking about a book? No, we're not talking about a book. We're not talking about a text. As important as the Book of Common Prayer is to the Episcopal Church, for example, that's not our liturgy. That's our guide to the liturgy. Our liturgy is a lived experience. It's the actual lived experience. So while we have legitimate debates right now about what changes we need to make in terms of the texts of our liturgy, what we have to always remember is the actual liturgy is the people who have assembled to worship. And those folks include me, an openly gay man as a priest. It includes, all of the other people, ordained and lay, who are in these parishes, who are offering their praise and thanksgiving to God. And to me, there's no more powerful message about contextualization than the actual people, bodies that assemble together to be present together and say that, yes, I, as all of who I am beloved of God. And because I'm beloved of God, I want to thank God and offer my praise and thanksgiving to God because of that. And that's ultimately what liturgy is all about, is remembering that we are loved of God, and through that remembering, then offering our praise and thanksgiving to God for that. And that's powerful. And that has been powerful in my own personal life and in the lives of others that I've seen and been able to pastor and be with, that they can look around. And do the words matter? Sure, yeah, they matter. Could we do some things to make the words even more welcoming and inclusive? We probably could, especially in our marriage rights. We've got some trial rights that, hopefully will get full authorization, and that's important. And it's important also when talking just generally, that we realize that, not everyone is a male-female couple, and all of those kinds of things. That's really, really important. But I think what's even more powerful is the presence, the embodied presence of queer people in our churches.
How do you think, or what has been your experience of VTS and that contextualization?
I think frankly, I think that is our strength, and we have some other places in which we could grow. I think that in terms of welcoming, and even in terms of our use of inclusive language, we use our expansive language liturgical resources, and so forth. And I think that, at least in the students I've talked with that are queer and identify as queer, feel very comfortable in our worship. Where I feel, as the Associate Dean of Chapel, where I feel a strong call is to do that more when it comes to race and ethnicity, and in particular non-English languages. That's where I feel the Episcopal Church as a whole, and Emmanuel Chapel as one part of the Episcopal Church, has we have a lot of work to do when it comes to, and that's in large part because we came from the Church of England. Right. Anglo is in our name, and we've got to really figure out what does it mean to be Anglican and not Anglo. And, and that I think is where we have a lot of work to do. And other places in the Anglican communion have done that work much better than we have here in the Episcopal Church. And so I think we have been able in the Episcopal Church to make a lot of movement forward when it comes to queer identity in church, but we have a lot of room to go when it comes to racial and ethnic identity.
What do you think your influence has been since coming as Associate Dean of Chapel on that inclusivity, both when it comes to LGBT individuals and with racial and language minorities? Have you seen a change and a shift in how chapel is done since when you were a student, and then to the time when Bishop Mathis was Dean of Chapel to now your tenure?
I think what I have been trying to do, and have been surprised at the progress I've made, because I've only been Associate Dean of Chapel I just finished my second full year. So I've been really surprised at the progress that I've been able to make in such a short time, is to try to mainstream things more. We had a lot of little pockets. We have, this type of worship at this time and this type of worship at this time. And I'm trying to kind of bring that together. So we did, we've had multicultural services on our Wednesday, which is our big, day. And we've had them as on Wednesday, which we had not had before. We've had prayer and praise services on Wednesday morning, which we had never had before. And so we've done, so that's Lutheran, and all of these. I'm trying to move this in a direction where it's less pockets and less silos, and more of this is kind of our expression. I've also tried to do that a lot with art. We've used a lot more art in chapel than I think we've ever done before, because for me that's a powerful way in which various cultures can be incorporated into worship. And Dr. Burnett and I are also committed with music and trying to do that with music. But it's challenging because there are, even among different larger cultural groups, within that, there, of course, there's no group is monolithic. So within that, there are different expressions of culture, and they don't always necessarily agree on everything. And so you've got to it's constantly a matter of navigating and negotiating, listening, hearing people's stories, and about what's important and why it's important to them. And then also realizing, what can we actually accomplish? Because at the end of, that's the thing about liturgy, is it happens, and it happens at a particular time and place. And, here we have services every day, and they have to happen. We can't just say pause while we figure this all out.
Right.
We're just going to pause. So we're trying to figure it out while we're also doing it, and doing all that. So it's complicated. It's challenging, but I find that really fulfilling. And I've learned a ton. I learned a great deal in my time here around that.
I think about, the history of this institution. It was known as the Virginia Low School. Now we're sort of just viewed as Big Tent Broad. And yet at the same time, I think of the amount of Anglo-Catholics in my class alone. What are the pressures to try and be it all, basically? Do you ever feel like there is a pressure for you to, as Paul said, be all things to all, so that you might save some?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I do. And there's two different, that pressure kind of manifests itself in two different ways. The way in which I am trying to move toward, and the way is my vision for chapel, is that it be a place, because chapel's not a parish. That's really important. And what I'm realizing even more and more, I have to really try to make that crystal clear to entering students when they come in. Emmanuel Chapel is not your new parish. It's not a parish. It's not anything like a parish, and never will be. And it shouldn't be a parish. It's a seminary chapel. And so, yes, it's a place of worship first and foremost, but it is also a place of formation for ministry. And so I believe very strongly that I want students to have at least some exposure to the various types of worship that they may experience in the Episcopal Church, the Communion, and our ecumenical partners for formative purposes. And I say this both in chapel and I teach this in class, that your own personal taste is really not the most important thing here. Now, if there's a parish that has one style of worship and you're way over here, okay, that might be important for you to discern. That might not be the right place. But going into a parish and deciding that your personal taste as the clergy person is what's going to prevail is a very unwise move to make. And it's devastated parishes and priests have been ruined when they take that approach, because they're not honoring the fact that liturgy is fundamentally about that gathered community that we were just talking about, and that's their expression of it. And so I try then to encourage students, hey, you may come to a worship service and you might be like, boy, that's not really for me. Well, rather than avoiding it, lean into it. Well, why not? And explore it and try to figure out what is that about? Because my concern is the other track, which is that worship, and particularly chapel worship here, becomes a kind of buffet, and you can pick and choose. And I do see that happening. And that probably more than anything else is what really grieves me here, is that I see students who will only come when certain services are offered, and they don't come at other times. And that to me is a very consumerist approach to worship, that it needs to feed me, and it's supposed to be taking care of me rather than being an offering of thanks and praise. And that concerns me generally for all Christians in the church, but it particularly concerns me for people preparing for leadership in the church, because that's not what worship's about. It's not about feeding me. It's about my offering of praise and thanksgiving. And yes, that should take in, we are going to offer that.
The outward focus that it should be, with also the fact that it should be contextualized within the body of believers gathered. If liturgy should reflect the people, how does it also not become self-serving? Becomes a challenge.
It sure does. Yeah, it sure does. And that's why keeping that core story is so important. And that's why, I might get myself in trouble now for what I'm about to say, but I'll say it anyway.
I mean, if you...
we won't need to redact it. I will stand by what I'm about to say. One of the reasons why I'm not a fan of themed Eucharistic services is because I believe that distracts us from that core story. And whether that is a Eucharist or a whatever, but there's also can be themes in terms of certain very important social justice issues that I personally would agree with. But if the whole service becomes around that, it moved us from that core story of the Paschal mystery of Christ's incarnation, life, death, resurrection, ascension, and second coming. That's the core story. And that I think if we start to fiddle with that and we start to change that or distract ourselves from that I think is then where we lose the inner hub of the wheel, of the spokes that come out, and we've lost that tension that's so necessary to keep this wider rim working and being able to operate. And that's why I think we've got to stay focused on that core story. And then from that, we talk about how do we live that out in the world, in terms of LGBTQ rights, in terms of economic justice and racial justice and gun violence and all of the other extremely important issues, that they should come from that core story.
So you wouldn't support, say, a drag mass, as it were?
No, I wouldn't. I sure wouldn't. And I love drag queens. I will stay on this record. I love RuPaul's Drag Race. I'm a huge fan of it. I think drag is a glorious form of art. Glorious form of art.
But the priest shouldn't put on a wig.
But it would distract from the core message.
So that brings me to a lot of pride events that we have. Because a lot of Episcopal churches will hold a Pride Eucharist. I've seen it go so far as they change the altar coverings to be the pride flag. What is your opinion on those types of Eucharistic services that are geared towards acknowledging of an event? Or do those still fall under your idea that these themes probably shouldn't be?
Yeah, well, at the risk of talking about something I don't want to be too specific without knowing exactly what the situation is. But that would always be my question going in is what we're doing enhancing the gospel message or distracting from it? Do I feel that Christ has been glorified even further and from this and then leads me out to march in the Pride Parade? Right. Or do I feel like the Pride Parade has now taken the place of Christ?
I see.
And if it's the latter, then and I have to say why? Like why? Because I think if Christ were here today, I think he'd be in a Pride Parade.
Right.
I wouldn't think he would have any problem with that. So why not preach Christ? And from that, then that we go out there and have that Pride Eucharist, and then go right out the door and go into the Pride Parade later that afternoon on Sunday, and so that's part of the dismissal. It can be part of our prayers to the people. It can be there, but just being careful that it doesn't replace or distract from that core message.
Well, and certainly we, the Episcopal Church has long, to the point that there's plenty of liturgies that you can pull from for like a Requiem Mass for AIDS victims and those things. So we have those resources,
right?
That we can build on.
And also, I do want to say too that there can be times in which you can have a particular focus for a service. And I think as long as you share that with the community and say, this is going to be a service that is going to be, particularly if there's been some kind of community tragedy or something like that, and say, we're going to have a special service for this, and this is our focus for that service, that we're really praying for this that has happened. I think that's important. We want to be, responsive, because we also don't want to be the opposite end, right? Where worship is, where we're all just, ostriches with our heads in the sand, and we're unaware of what's going out around in the world around us, and our worship service doesn't, it seems as if it's clueless as to what's actually going on. Right. That's not helpful either. That's not understanding that we're bringing our full selves into worship.
Yeah, I think of like when Matthew Shepard's ashes were interred at the Washington Cathedral. The service, the liturgy itself, was very much the burial of the dead, right to from the prayer book.
Yeah.
But the focus was still much larger than even Matthew Shepard. So there are ways. To do what you're saying.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to LGBT people coming to VTS?
Coming to VTS. Bring your whole self. Bring your whole self, who you are. And I mean, this is going to be a lifetime journey of constantly reminding yourself that you're beloved of God. And particularly if you're coming here to prepare for leadership in the church, lay ordained leadership in the church in some way, to really be able to hear and embody that message, I am beloved of God, is so important, because if I don't believe it as a leader, people I'm preaching to, teaching, ministering to, pastoring with aren't going to believe it. But if I do, it's powerful. It's so powerful, because I think more than anything else, that's what people yearn for, of all stripes. They want to know they're loved, and not just loved in the kind of temporary way that our pop songs talk about, and the popular culture talks about, that lasts a night or a year or whatever, but that they're loved and cared for and will be by an eternal creator. I mean, that's powerful. If we really let that sink in, that's powerful stuff. And I think in some ways, where the church as a whole in North America and Europe and other places where we are in decline has missed its boat, is we need to get back to that core message and really believe it. And really believe it in a way that surprises us. I can't tell you how many times I was shocked a couple of weeks ago. I preached for Trinity Sunday, and I preached what I thought was a kind of a teachy kind of sermon. I like preaching teachy sermons because I'm a teacher. I have to be careful sometimes about that don't get too teachy in my sermon. And I thought I was a little teachy in this sermon. I was praying about the Trinity or preaching about the Trinity and how this communion of love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, taking a very Eastern Orthodox kind of viewpoint on this, and that we're made in the image of God, and since we're made in the image of God, and God is therefore this communion of love, we are meant to be in a communion of love with each other. And I said, Amen. I get out of the pulpit. I turn my head back toward the altar, and the congregation erupts in applause. I'm shocked. I was shocked. I'm still shocked. It's like, what is that? I mean, I'm a decent preacher, I know that, but I was surprised that there's just this spontaneous applause. And I think what it was is I believed it, and there was my sincerity in really believing, hey, this is important, and they believed it through that. They believed me because I really believed it. And they wanted to hear that that we serve a God who is so in love with God's self that when we become part of that, that's what we're drawn into, is this. And it's a powerful message, but it also has its detractors. And I believe in evil. And I'm not necessarily saying that evil's got horns and tail and pitchfork, but I believe in what we might call a transpersonal system or force of evil that works in this world. And we've seen it. We've seen it in this country. We've seen it in others. And those of us who are queer, we know this. I don't have to talk about that too much because we know it. We've felt it. We've experienced it in our own lives. But we can't ever forget it because that's out there too. And that is a message that's trying so hard to cut through this message of love and to tell us you're not loved, you're not good enough, you're not pretty enough, you're not all of these things enough. And it's trying to cut through this message of love. And we have to resist it with all. And it doesn't go away with ordination. Those messages still stay. You're not working hard enough as a priest. You're not holy enough. You're not praying enough. You're not all these things. Those messages still stick around. So what I would tell everyone coming to VTS, including queer folk, bring your whole self and know that you're beloved of God. And while you're here, consider this a journey of love while you're at seminary, of how you can deepen that, not just intellectually, that's one way, but through your whole experience here, so that then you're prepared when you leave here in whatever ministry God calls you to be able to share that with other people.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Is there anything else you would like to share with us?
I don't think so. I think that's a nice note to end on.
Right. Thank you again.